Welcome very much to the LSE for this online event. My name is Kathy Hostetler, and I'm professor and head of the Department of International Development here at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm very pleased to be here to welcome a really exciting panel to the LSE today. They will be discussing how to stimulate a green economy in Latin America. And of course, we're very interested in recovery, and we're very interested in green, and very interested to hear about what potential there might be for the region in that. I will be discussing them briefly, but you will find more information about their extensive experience on the events page. This online event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, assuming we don't have technical difficulties. As usual, there will be the chance for you to put your questions to the speakers. To submit your questions, please use the chat function. The questions will then come to myself, and I will pose as many as possible to the speakers. As usual protocol now, please do turn off your cameras to limit the bandwidth requirement for participants at this point, but then we'd like to have you turn on your cameras and let us know your name and affiliation. We are particularly keen to hear from our students, alumni, and incoming students, so please do let us know. We're going to be starting today hearing Dr. Amir Lebdioui. He will speak first on the general importance of a green recovery in Latin America. He is the Canning House Research Fellow based at the LSE's Latin America and Caribbean Center, which is sponsoring today's events. The speaker after that is going to be Mr. José Luis Samaniego, Director of the Sustainable Development and Human Settlements Department at the UN Economic Commission of Latin America. That's CEPAL or ECLA for those of you who know it better by its abbreviation. Mr. Samaniego will speak about the policy recommendations of the recent CEPAL report and what has been done to date towards the green recovery objective in the region. After that, we'll hear from Ms. Lisa Viscidi. She's the director of the Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Ms. Viscidi will be presenting a case study on green recovery in Peru. And then our final speaker will be Dr. Manuel Albaladejo, head of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, for the Southern Cone. He will present the connections between the green economy and circular economy ideas. But you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear our many really interesting speakers. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Amir to start us off.
Thank you, Katie, for the introductions. So let me share my screen. Oh. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, perfect. So thanks, Katie, for the introductions, and I'm really happy to talk about such an important issue and alongside such insightful speakers. So the COVID-19 crisis has hit Latin America particularly hard, both in human and economic terms. But looking forward, this is also an opportunity to build back better, right, and build a greener development model. The idea of a green recovery really consists in addressing several different but interrelated objectives, right? That is kind of addressing different crises, the economic, basically addressing economic development, social inclusion, and decarbonization all at once by creating a vibrant, climate resilient economy with broadly shared benefits for all. So the focus of my presentation today is to identify 5 main reasons as to why the recovery needs to be green in Latin America. The first one has to do with environmental goals. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a widespread perception that the COVID-19 crisis had a positive impact on the environment because of reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Nevertheless, those are very likely to bounce back, and in fact, they've already started to bounce back as lockdowns that were temporary were lifted off, as people favor using their personal cars over public transportation to reduce contamination risks. So this is why on the long term, there's a real cause for concern in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the environment. The other issue has to do with the strength and the resilience of renewable energy supply chains. I won't go into that in too much details now, maybe if there is interest in the Q&A, but the idea is that the crisis has had a huge impact on supply chains across many sectors, including renewable energy supply chains. And because of the dependence on few producers, few countries, including China. And the idea is that regionalizing supply chains could help strengthen the sector and long-term renewable energy deployment. The second issue has to do with public health, right? A green recovery can be seen as a public health problem. So COVID-19 has had an impact on the environment, but the environment also has an impact on the resilience to pandemics. Several studies have shown that a cleaner air as a result of renewable energy deployment was associated with reduced risks of COVID-19 related death, especially for people who have respiratory problems. And secondly, environmental protection helps reduce the risks of transmission of diseases from animals to humans, such as the coronavirus, which is a zoonotic disease. So in that light, the green recovery is essential, right, in terms of ensuring the resilience to future and avoid future pandemics. The third aspect has to do with jobs creation. In a region that is still characterized by very high unemployment rates, the energy transition can be an opportunity to create jobs. Again, there's an increasing number of studies that have shown the net job gains of energy transitions. That is, if you invest in renewable energies, you create more jobs than the amount of jobs that is lost in fossil fuels. And that has to do with the higher labor intensity in clean energy activities compared to fossil fuels, and a higher domestic content of spending, which tends to increase when retrofitting existing building stocks. In terms of retrofitting, José Luis has some really interesting insights on that, so I'll let him address that. The International Renewable Energy Agency has also consistently mapped out the amount of jobs created in renewable energy sectors, and it has been consistently increasing in the past 10 years to reach almost 12 million jobs in 2019. However, what we can see is that the geographic distribution of these jobs is uneven, right? In Latin America, with the exception of Brazil, and here again, Kathy has worked a lot on renewable energy jobs in Brazil, so she can talk about that at more length. But apart from Brazil, Latin American countries have not managed to create that many jobs in the sector. And that shows that actions need to be taken if they are to reap some of the employment benefits of the global energy transition. The fourth point has to do with commodity dependence. Latin America and South America in particular is arguably one of the most commodity-dependent regions in the world. South American countries depend on either agriculture, where productivity is intrinsically linked to precipitation or temperature fluctuations. So, for example, a 1 degree increase in temperature can have a massive impact, right, on the productivity of salmon farming in Chile, shrimp production in Ecuador, or coffee production in Colombia. They're dependent on fossil fuels, some of them, Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, which are at risk of becoming stranded assets as we undergo decarbonization of the world economy, and on the so-called minerals of the future, lithium, copper, which are key ingredients of low carbon technologies. But even then, there is still a risk of technological disruption. I mean, there's large amounts of R&D of R&D funding is being put into lithium-less batteries, phosphate-based batteries, and so on. And if those technologies scale up and become commercially viable, countries that depend on lithium will face a dramatic crisis. So in order to escape, right, to mitigate the risks and economic vulnerability to climate change, South American countries need to diversify, and green industries could provide an avenue for diversification. The last point relates to the changing demand in key consumer markets. So even across the world in key consumer economies are increasingly popular Green Deal proposals. And these proposals clearly include the incorporation of sustainability standards for trade and imports. And what that means is that if Latin American countries want to retain a position in these markets or to export to those markets, they would need to also green their production systems. So in a way, that shows that a green recovery could be also a way to retain a position in those foreign markets. Now, in terms of kind of how to get there, market forces will not suffice. Right? States have policy tools are needed to reap the economic benefits of green transitions. That's why recovery packages need to be anchored into forward-looking and coherent green industrial policies, including suppliers development programs, fiscal incentives, R&D support and funding, and reorienting education systems and training programs to provide green skills. However, in terms of the response of Latin American governments to date, there has been very different degrees in which governments have included climate goals at the core of their recovery programs or responses to the crisis. Maybe on a scale from Costa Rica to Brazil. Costa Rica has clearly been the country that has pushed the most for environmental considerations in its response to the crisis, notably by launching last year a bioeconomy strategy to promote a green knowledge economy. On the other hand of the spectrum, in a country like Brazil, the COVID-19 crisis has led to increased deforestation. The crisis occurred already in a context of dismantlement of environmental protection laws, but led to a further scale back of environmental enforcement. As a result, over 11,000 square meters of the Amazon was destroyed. This is the highest since 2008, and this is triple the amount that is allowed under Brazilian law. And between these two cases, there are countries like Argentina, where contradictory goals have been pursued. So on the one hand, the government has pushed for environmental education, but at the same time, as a response to the crisis, has subsidized fossil fuel production and encouraged investments in meat production. And countries like Ecuador, that has chosen the fiscal austerity path, including cuts in the education budget. And that still matters in terms of green recovery, because as I just mentioned, a green recovery also requires green skills and green human capital. So to conclude, is a green stimulus in Latin America too risky, too costly, unrealistic? The main message that I want to emphasize here is that the alternatives to a green recovery program are far riskier and more expensive in the long term than a green recovery program. The COVID crisis has been devastating for the region, but recovering from it also provides an opportunity to take bold, drastic, and necessary steps towards a greener development model. But one question remains, which is, what are the specific solutions and way forward? And this is when we turn towards the other speakers of this event that have really interesting ideas and proposals, concrete proposals, to discuss in terms of promoting a green recovery agenda. So thank you very much. And if you want further information on the Canning House Research Forum and contact details, you can find them here.
Thank you so much, Amir, and thanks for starting us off so very well and with that charge for a focus on the green economy. And we'll go now to José Luis, who will take us on into looking more deeply at the solutions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation from the London School of Economics and for this very interesting talk. Let me know when you were seeing my presentation, so I'm sure I'm very good. Okay, so I'll move a little bit here. You know, we support the Agenda 2030 as a very important North Pole, let's say, a compass for development. And we identify within it three basic pillars: the social pillar, the planet, prosperity, people, planet, prosperity, let's say. And that can be simplified or summarized in different rates of growth. And what's been happening structurally in Latin America and the Caribbean is that it's a continent that's so unequal that you need a very high rate of growth to be able to close what we call the social gap. And let's say that we simplify this by addressing the necessary rate of growth to eliminate poverty. And that would have to be up to 4% a year in the region, with a very strong distribution effort in order to really eliminate poverty by 2030. But that rate is excessively high for the structure, the economic structure of the region, so dependent on natural resources and primary exports. That the relationship between exports and imports places a ceiling on the rate of growth that is compatible with what we call the external restriction, which is a need for incurring into debt or devaluating or incurring in sudden stops in the economy. And that is around between 1.4 and 2.6% a year, compared to the 4% that we need to close the social gap. But even this lower rate of growth is excessive if we want to keep the region within the environmental boundaries, simplified and exemplified by the carbon footprint of the region. We would have to restrain growth to below 1.2% to be able to stay within the environmental boundaries. So this is a very, very, very hard dilemma to resolve. How can we make these rates of growth converge? There are only very few sectors in the Latin American region that can allow those rates of growth to converge. Why? Because they're more inclusive, so you need to grow less. They create more jobs. Second, they're more compatible with the economic structure because you can produce that internally. And third, they have a lower carbon footprint, so you can grow more. And that way you can converge among these three rates of growth. Which are these sectors that enable the convergence, the simultaneous achievement of planet prosperity and people? Renewable energies, clearly, we'll see the numbers. Sustainable mobility, particularly in public transportation. You need to do a digital enablement for people to be included in these particular conditions of 2020, 2021. The health and care industry for a population that is aging and is basically concentrated in cities. Bioeconomy, as Amir has just mentioned, circular economy and sustainable tourism, particularly for the Caribbean and for the Central American countries. Some numbers that can give the objective support for this. Amir has already presented some of the dates, the employment intensity of GDP in energy. But here I use the example of Chile. The contribution to GDP of the renewable energy sector, analyzed with the input-output matrix, is 30% superior to what fossil fuels traction on GDP. It creates 140% more of employment per dollar invested. It reduces, in the operation phase, of course, almost 99% of the emissions. And for the rest of the economy, it is 50% cheaper per megawatt generated. And the same we can see in several other sectors. For example, if we take the integrated agricultural with cattle raising approaches in Brazil, it results in a 2.5 times increase in productivity with a 70% less of carbon footprint, with no significant impact on employment or costs for the economy. The same is true for electric mobility, where emissions fall by 70% and costs, operation costs plus capital costs from a life cycle perspective fall by 20%. And here we are talking about what happens in Mexico City, in China, in Chile, in California too. And if we were able to recycle solid waste, for example, to the levels of Germany, we would be increasing at least 0.35% of GDP in the countries. And we also have very positive data on wages with no significant impact on costs. where are the policies and what is the rationale of policy intervention to achieve a greener recovery and a greener development in the medium term? Well, you have to address these 5 areas of work: fiscal policy, social policy, environmental, industrial, and integration, harmonization at the regional level, which is indispensable. But what is the rationale? Is to change the relative profitabilities between sunsetting industries and rising industries, these 7 sectors that we're identifying here. Just to give a couple of examples, in the case of fiscal policy, you need to internalize costs through the fiscal policy by taxing pollution, taxing fortunes, taxing financial operations, avoiding fiscal illusion and other illegal behaviors in the fiscal area. In the case of environment, not only environmental internalizations, you have to promote the low carbon sectors. And in terms of industrial policy, to give an example which is very telling for the region, innovation, of course, but simply by enabling legally the introduction of the alternative productions, we would be making a leap towards a greener recovery in the region. CEPAL has proposed a number of policy recommendations for the short run that were published during 2020. For example, to enhance the ability for Latin American countries to jointly produce vaccines and their distribution, and to turn several industries like the textile industry into health consumables. Second, to extend an emergency basic income, or to implement, where there is none, an emergency basic income at least for 12 months that is equivalent to 1 poverty line, to extend or to facilitate the repayment of loans for small and medium enterprises, to make available a basic digital basket for inclusion for the people who are confined, such as a laptop, a tablet, or a low-cost connectivity plan, to internalize the need to live in an environment of expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, to be solidarious with the Caribbean areas that are highly indebted and they cannot rebound because of the high gravitation of debt on GDP, to foster recovery plans based on environmental sustainability, and we will abound in the next slide a little bit more on that, and to use policy, politics, and fiscal pacts to favor the change into a greener recovery. If we focus on the short term, we can see that with this very urbanized population in Latin America and the Caribbean, we need to focus on the expansion on quality and quantity of public services. Let me put a couple of examples. One is the quality and quantity of coverage on water and sanitation infrastructure in the region. Already Amir has talked about the multipliers of employment for every dollar in investment, but also we need to improve and retrofit popular housing neighborhoods and buildings to enable them to operate within social distancing requirements. We need to improve the public space allocated to public mobility and the infrastructure for active mobilities, which is happening in the region, and avoid the financial stress of public transportation systems due to the pandemic, because people are preferring to go back to private transportation rather than public transportation. It's a good moment, it's a good opportunity to enhance environmental services payments, and this could be done from cities to the rural areas. And what I mentioned earlier, facilitate the legal entry through regulatory enablement of more sustainable productions, products, and services. 2 outstanding examples. One is the retrofitting of vehicles to change them from internal combustion engines into electric and to allow into the economy recycled materials. If we went green, we could shorten the pain, at least in 1 year in an optimistic scenario, and by many years in a more pessimistic scenario, with almost a 10% gain in either case at the end of the period. Is that fundable? Yes, but we have to use all the alternatives. the public spending, the elimination of the fossil fuel subsidies, to go into the international markets to get monies, to reduce tax evasion and avoidance, to tax carbon, and then for the whole period, we would even have a surplus in investment, and we would be able to boost the rate of capital formation and the rate of growth close to that 4%, and if, of course, we choose regional productions, to close the three gaps that I mentioned earlier simultaneously. Is Latin America going there? No, Amir mentioned it. Outstanding countries, yes, Costa Rica, but also Panama. Some of the Caribbean countries, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Cuba, Bahamas, but they're focusing on very small green initiatives. For example, the economy of care, a few rural activities, and retrofitting some of the housing. But we have seen none on, for example, public transportation or renewable energies. And a red flag here is development banks keep on funding brown credit operations. That's alarming too. So the situation is not a very positive situation. It could be done much more, but you need political will to do this. That's it. Thank you, Catherine.
Well, yes, we need political will for a great deal of that. Thank you very much for that interesting presentation and agenda setting there. And we'll go now to Lisa Viscidi to talk about Peru.
I don't know what that actually means.
Someone does seem to have a microphone on, so if you could be sure that's off. Thank you. Lisa?
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. And I also want to thank Amir and LSE for the invitation to participate in this event. Very interesting presentation so far. Anna, I guess if you want to go ahead and show my presentation. Great, thank you. So I will kind of focus on one aspect of the idea of green recovery, looking at how do we finance it. And so I want to present some findings from a report that I produced with my colleague Nate Graham at the Inter-American Dialogue on the role of oil and mining revenues. We focused on really the role of oil and mining revenues in climate change, mitigation and adaptation. And part of that, we also looked at could this mean for a sustainable economic recovery. And we worked on case studies of Colombia and Peru, but I'm going to try to talk about what I think were the lessons learned for the region overall, not just for those two countries. So you could go to the next slide, please. So I think one of the questions is, why would we want to look at using extractive industry revenue to fight climate change? And I think that our reasoning had sort of two basic reasons for focus. One was kind of the economic. So one thing that we thought is Latin America is one of the world's richest regions in natural resources. The oil and mining sectors contribute a significant share of fiscal revenues in the region's economies. And so as the economies seek to rebuild in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, there is an opportunity to accelerate climate change mitigation and adaptation and use these revenues for more sustainable economic models. And I think, many of the extractives dependent countries are having a discussion. The oil and mining industries are saying we can contribute to the recovery. And then we also looked at the environmental reasons. The production of fossil fuels, minerals, and metals directly generates significant emissions. So, the oil industry is responsible for about 10% of global emissions. The mining industry also, especially because it uses so much electricity, produces a lot of emissions itself. And so one of the reasons that you would want to use these revenues is that it's a way to offset or compensate for the environmental impact. And then I also think that the fossil fuel industries like oil and natural gas and coal are confronting major long-term shifts in their operations, and they'll likely face declining demand for their emissions generating products as a result of climate policy. And so extractive industry revenues can support countries' efforts to diversify away from fossil fuels for energy consumption in the longer term. So they can invest this money from the fossil fuel industry now to diversify away and reduce their demand on fossil fuels so that they can be prepared for the energy transition. And then finally, in the case of many metals and minerals, demand is actually expected to increase as the world transitions to cleaner forms of energy. So those revenues will actually become more abundant. And so this could be also thinking about a way to use them. So would you go to the next slide, please? So as I said, many Latin American countries receive large sums from the extractive industries. So just to give examples, in Colombia, in 2018, overall fiscal oil and gas and mining revenue was more than $7 billion, which is equivalent to around 9% of the government budget. In Peru, subnational governments alone received more than $2.3 billion from mining and hydrocarbons in 2018. So this is a large share of money that they need to look at how to spend. Next slide, please. At the same time, all the Latin American countries have established emissions reduction targets. So Colombia just in December improved or upgraded its nationally determined contribution, promising to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 51% by 2030 compared to baseline. And Peru also increased its pledge to 40% reductions by 2030 compared to their emissions trajectories. The largest share of emissions in Latin American countries in most countries come from land use change. So this is a real priority for climate change policy in the region. In Amazon countries, governments have struggled to fight deforestation. It continues to trend upward in most countries. And in 2016, for example, land use and agriculture accounted for more than half of Peru's emissions and more than 40% of Colombia's. But transport and electricity are also major drivers of emissions. And of course, climate change adaptation is also a major concern. The region suffers from less predictable rainfall patterns, extreme weather events such as droughts and landslides. And all of this has a devastating effect on the country's agricultural sector. So it's also an issue for human health and safety. Next slide, please. So what we saw in our research, what we found is that really only a small share of extractives revenues in Colombia is being spent on every year on climate related projects like clean energy infrastructure, reforestation, disaster resilience. But we did see that, as you can see in the chart, that there's an increasing trend toward more and more use of extractive revenues for climate change projects. And so we identified 132 climate related projects accounting for $140 million of investment since 2012, but this is actually less than 1% of the total projects approved and out of billions of dollars of investment. Next slide, please. We also found that although the projects related to climate change are relatively few, they have been very diverse in Colombia. So projects that reduce energy emissions, mostly through renewable energy, were the largest. And this was largely rural electrification. We also saw projects in climate change adaptation and land use emissions. And so in Colombia, you know, we saw a fairly positive trend toward using these revenues. You could go to the next slide, please. In Peru, extractives revenue spending on climate change was very, very low. So we didn't really see that they were using the revenues for this purpose. It was less than 0.01% of all oil and mining revenues, oil, gas, and mining revenues were used for these projects. Next slide, please. And what we mostly saw was flood control was the main use of the funds in the bucket of climate change mitigation and adaptation. And of course, I mean, Peru has increasing difficulty partly because of climate change with flooding. And so a lot of the local governments clearly wanted to use the funds for this. Next slide, please. So I think that there are a lot of barriers to why we didn't see more use of these revenues. And I think they also have a lot of implications for how local governments can use resources to address climate change, because most of the time extractive industries revenues are being used by local governments. So some of the reasons that we didn't see more use of extractive revenues for climate change was a lack of alignment between national priorities that the governments proposed and how they actually were spent in practice. Prioritizing, local governments have a tendency to prioritize more visible projects that will be more politically popular, like a new road, compared to mitigation and adaptation projects where people may not directly see the benefits, or the benefits may not happen for a very long time. And this is going to be an issue for any type of sustainable recovery. Also, the funds were very concentrated in communities where oil and mining takes place. And so because climate change adaptation projects, for example, generally affect a large area of the country, you need to be able to coordinate among multiple local governments. That is a big barrier. There's also just a lack of technical capability to execute funds. So a huge share of the funds were never even spent because they don't have the ability to design or to implement the projects. And so the projects tended to be very small in size. Next slide, please. But I do think that there are also a lot of opportunities that we can take out of this. So countries that more effectively use extractive revenues for climate-related projects, if central governments, they can do that if central governments provide more clear and specific guidance to subnational governments on climate priorities. So I think one of the things that we required in a green recovery is for the national government to give guidance to the local government so that they can carry out projects. And at the same time, they have to give them technical assistance. They actually have the ability to do that. And then subnational governments, I think, should disseminate more information to local communities on the benefits of climate change mitigation and adaptation, because as I said, they tend to be less tangible or take a long time to see the benefits. And you need local communities to understand why this is important for them if they're going to support the process politically and socially. And that buy-in is going to be important for any type of, investment in green infrastructure or climate change adaptation. So I also think that ultimately governments may need to dedicate funds directly for sustainable development. So instead of just kind of allowing local governments to decide their priorities, they may need to specify what they think, specify a certain percentage would be needed for climate change. And then the economic recovery from COVID presents an opportunity to reform some of the systems for spending these revenues and to reorient them toward more resilient and sustainable development models. And some examples are reforestation, conservation, ecosystem adaptation, are areas that could create rural jobs. So we talked about jobs in renewable energy, but there's also a lot of potential for jobs in forestry. And so you could also kind of combine these extractive revenues with other sources of funding, like international finance, in order to make it possible to have projects on scale. So I'll conclude there, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Lisa. You reminded me of old discussions about semiad el petróleo, but I don't think in the old discussions of that the purposes were really climate purposes. So it's interesting to hear about another perspective there. Well, our final speaker now is Dr. Manuel Albaladejo.
I hope you can see my screen. You can. Well, first of all, thank you so much, LSC, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. In fact, this is the first Zoom meeting of the year for us. We are just in the middle of summer here in Montevideo, so it's nice to be here with you. And yeah, it's great to listen to everything that is being said. The advantage of being last actually is the fact that many of the things have been said already. So I'll just touch upon a few elements and build on another aspects that have been raised during the previous talks. But I want to talk about the circular economy. It's one of the mega trends that we actually see, not only in Latin America, but around the world, which speaks very closely to the whole idea of green recovery. And this is, in fact, one of the main areas of work of UNIDO. UNIDO is the Industrial Development Organization of the UN. And we mainly work on technical cooperation projects, implementing funds coming from multilateral funding windows like the Green Environmental Facility or the Green Climate Fund. But the talk today is about the international trade. I want to make a specific link on the circular economy and international trade, especially in a region that is always open for business. I mean, some of the countries are champions of multilateral agreements around the world. And together with that, you've got a big push for this green recovery. And we want to see how these two things speak to each other. But before I move into the topic of the circular of trade, the link between circular economy and trade, I want to make a reference to this important cover of the Life magazine that was published in 1955, which is in fact what we see today. This is the embracing of the take, make, and dispose economic model that we actually face today. So we are part of this wasteful generation where you know, at that time, at that point in time, the idea of generating waste was never a problem. In fact, it was pretty cool to be in a position to throw your dishes, your knives, your forks, because there was no need to be clean, and the result of that is what we're facing today. So this idea of a linear economy is what we've been suffering for almost 70 years, and this is where we are at the moment. And this has brought this idea of the circular economy as a way to rescue some of these principles that were lost in the way. Now, let me phrase the concept of circular economy and what to me is one of the key issues for green recovery, which is the decoupling of economic growth with resource use. The whole idea of decoupling is that of doing more with less. If we keep growing, but at the same time we continue to use resources in the same manner, there is no way that we're going to meet the 2030 development agenda. We're going to meet the SDGs. Certainly, we're not going to meet the commitments of the Paris Agreement. And therefore, this idea of decoupling resource consumption with economic growth is really at the heart of what the circular economy is all about. This whole idea is about resource efficiency, but the circular economy is much more than that. I think this concept that was portrayed by a UNEP report really throws light on the concept that to grow, you don't need to use resources in the same manner. You just need to use resources much more efficiently. Now, the whole circular economy debate is certainly a paradigm shift in a way that allows us to think differently about business models. The linear economy is all about take, make, use, and dispose. The recycling economy, there's quite a lot of confusion about whether recycling is part of the circular economy. You could argue, yes, it is part of the circular economy. However, recycling should not be an end on itself, because for the recycling sector to survive, you need to generate waste. The real circular economy is about not generating any waste at all. It's about creating these virtuous circles that allow products to extend their life over time, and this is the paradigm shift. The paradigm shift parts with the idea that you should redesign things in a way that you basically design out waste, and that's the whole concept on the circular economy. Now, if we think that there's a difference between recycling waste or creating value out of waste and the circular economy, then we've got two different hierarchies of how we should be managing waste and how we should be promoting the circular economy. On the left, you basically have a value hierarchy for waste management. So if you reduce, reduce or you recycle, compost, and so on and so forth, you're generating value out of the waste that exists. Now, if you move into the circular economy, the most impactful measure that you can actually take are reducing, preventing, or eliminating to start with. So the whole idea of servitization or dematerialization of sectors is what the circular economy is all about. You really generate value by selling services instead of products, or dematerializing sectors. The whole idea of, the application or, the replication of models like Spotify and Netflix to the manufacturing sector is a perfect example of how you can use the circular economy in many other sectors. Now, circular economy is a triple impact approach. It really affects the economy, employment, as well as the climate. Here I want to focus on climate change. Lisa's been talking about the use of resources, and some of the previous speakers, Amir in particular, has been talking about this transition toward renewable energy as a way to combating climate change. But certainly it's interesting to look at, the impact of how we produce and consume products on climate, and what comes out from a research done by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is that 45% of emissions could be reduced by a different way of producing and consuming products. In this case, we're focusing on food, steel, cement, plastic, and aluminum. So by focusing on those and changing the way we produce towards a circular business models, we can reduce dramatically the emissions to the atmosphere. Now, let me then move into a topic that I think is totally under-researched, which is the link between circular economy and trade. In fact, the circular economy in some circles is an anti-globalization type of agenda. People think that, because of the disruptions of global value chains, there is the need to revamp the national production systems, and therefore, rely less and less on international trade. And I think there's a mistake about that interpretation, in the way that the trade actually creates a demand stimulus for the circular economy, and I'll get into that. But on the top of the slide, you basically have how the circular economy speaks to countries. When you look at national boundaries, you're looking at, what are the different elements of the circular economy that can add value to a country in terms of, reuse, repair, recycling, refurbishment, redesigning, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem that we face in many countries is that you either have a very small country market demand, or you don't have technological solutions to create value out of the waste that you generate. And this is where trade becomes very handy. So what we actually see is now a trend towards increased flows of commerce in services, secondhand goods, trading waste and scrap, and so on and so forth. And this is the way the international trade is actually talking to the circular economy. Now, unfortunately, in our research, we have not been able to capture all these dimensions, just because they're not, we cannot trace many of these items in international trade. So we just had to limit ourselves to trade flows in industrial waste. But even so, the results are pretty interesting. This is the result of a paper that we've written together with CEPAL, which has been just published now in early January. And I'll give you a reference for that. But one of the elements that I think is mind-blowing here is to actually realize that, the trade for industrial waste is actually growing faster than the average for total trade globally. So you've got massive flows of industrial waste being circulated from region to region. And that only does not apply to the world, but applies to Latin America as well, as you can see. So what you've got here is an interesting scenario of waste being circulated around the world for someone to profit from it, right? And what you would think is that normally the flows goes from developed countries to developing countries, right? But that is not the case. You will see that is not the case. So number one, you've got this fact that industrial waste is growing globally, well above the average for total trade. The second one is that there's a growing price for industrial waste in global markets. Someone is paying a huge price for this industrial waste. And the third element is that these flows of industrial waste trade is actually happening within developed regions. This is happening within the European Union, or between the European Union and Asian countries. So what is very interesting is, well, if this is really a waste, you would be likely to see more developing countries showing up in this. But the truth is that perhaps industrial waste is more as a resource. It's a resource than a waste per se, as a concept. And this is an interesting thought, but because what we've actually come to realize is that in many sectors, some of these products coming out of recycling and so on and so forth could be even more profitable than those that are coming directly from destructive industries. And this is the case of aluminum, it's the case of steel, it's even the case of copper. And that's why we actually get to see firms like this in Chile doing urban mining in a mining country. More and more, we actually get to see firms that actually embrace the circular economy and generate value out of waste of electric and electronic apparatus and sell these final products, which are inputs for industrial processes like copper dust or aluminum ingots to the world, and they're basically exporting these products. Now, for this, you need to have a conducive environment for these companies to generate value out of waste and of course, export it. Now, Amir mentioned the Green New Deal, and for us is one of the most interesting features of what's coming in terms of green economic recovery, because at the heart of the Green New Deal is the transition to a circular economy, and the European Union has made it very clear that it will be supporting a circular economy transition around the world. But one thing is how the European Union phrases the concept of circular economy in terms of supporting countries addressing the circular economy in their policy agenda. The other thing is how this will present a restriction and opportunity for companies to enter European markets. And I think that is an important issue. What we see is that the Green Deal will establish certain types of market requirements for companies, Latin American companies that want to enter European Union markets. And that is going to be an opportunity as well as a threat for many companies. For some companies, this would be a technical barrier to trade, which we have seen many times. But for other countries, it would be a way to actually redesign their industrial processes to really produce these sort of products. Now, let me just conclude by saying that from our side, the circular economy debate really is at the heart of Latin America's green recovery. I like very much José Luis' presentation in a sense that we see this as part of the new generation of green industrial policies. We see the circular economy linked up to the concept of Industry 4.0. The advent of the fourth industrial revolution is a way to speed up the circular economy transition. So we believe that this is something that is going to be in the agenda for the next 20, 30 years. And specifically on the trade element, I think really international trade expands the market prospects for circular products. Small countries like many of the Caribbean countries, or even in the Southern Cone, there's no possibility of selling these products domestically. They need to rely on neighboring countries. Therefore, trade becomes very handy. In many cases, there's no technological solution for the valorization of products, and they need to seek these opportunities somewhere else. And the last point that I want to emphasize again is the issue of these global standards that are coming, either through the Basel Convention or the new standards coming from the ISO, the International Standards Organization, and the market requirements that come from bilateral markets. This is all I have to say for now. I just want to refer to you to the publications that we've produced over the last months. One with Chatham House on circular economy in Latin America, and this second orange document together with CEPAL on the link between circular economy and trade. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much, Manuel. Boy, that really was an interesting set of presentations there. And I can tell that they were as interesting as I thought they were because we already have the chat full of questions. So those of you who have additional questions could put them into the chat, but we are originally scheduled to end in just 15 minutes. So even though everyone has stayed beautifully on time, we do still have limited time for the questions. So I'll also be reading the questions from the chat and looking to you for fairly prompt or fairly quick responses to them. We will try to answer as many of the questions as possible. So our first question comes from Javier Jaraba. Came up during Jose Luis's talk, but I think several of you might have responses to this. He's really raising the just transition question. You have mentioned that renewables generate more employment than non-renewable sources, but people who work in fossil fuel industries, for instance, will not be automatically prepared to work in other areas of knowledge. They're not prepared for those. What to do with people who will now be laid off from those industries? A nation doesn't turn green overnight. So Jose Luis, is that one that you can take?
Yes. And it has a difficulty not only with the training aspect of the problem. Particularly in the case of several Latin American countries, fossil fuel workers or fossil fuel industry workers have a very different social protection regime than the rest of the population. So there's a very high level of friction of moving them to another sector if their social protection, health coverage, pension plans are linked to that job, which speaks to that social area of policy that I addressed very quickly, where you need to have a universal approach to social protection to be able to lubricate the structure, to allow people to move from one sector to another sector without losing their rights. Rights have to be portable throughout the economy. And that is only achievable through social protection. And of course, linked to the question, you need to retrain the people and do it in an organized manner. If you just leave it to the market, sacrifice and pain is maximized. And you don't want to maximize social pain. You want to do it in an orderly manner, in a just transition environment. And for the person that asked about this Escazú, this kind of social acceptance, social licensing, diversifying the interlocutors for policy changes is indispensable. So I think that for structural change, you need a very strong social policy approach of universal rights.
Okay, well, you really answered two questions at once there. He was talking about the Escazú Agreement on freedom of information on environmental issues in the region, which is, of course, a very important agreement. And thank you for handling that one as well. I will go on to the next question from Bruno Cunha. And hello, Bruno, a Brazilian researcher. I remember him at LSE, based in Costa Rica and Brazil. I would like to hear from Amir in particular, his views on the role of regulation for a green recovery, i.e. not the fiscal tools, but the regulatory tools. Latin American countries have embraced a neoclassical leaning type of regulation over the years, which seeks to correct but not to create markets. And different studies have also stressed the out of equilibrium nature of decarbonization, which is largely at odds with the dominant regulatory orthodoxy. So is regulation for a green economy in infrastructure sectors, as well as to allow for structural upgrades in others, or even for the creation of markets, of primary or secondary importance in your view? Or to cut to the chase, what's the role of regulation in these changes that you see needed for a green recovery?
Thanks, Bruno, for the question. It's a very complex question, and I think maybe the other speakers might also have an opinion on the matter. But yeah, market-based mechanisms such as carbon taxes, carbon permits, and so on have been the standard neoclassical response to climate change, which is why it gained great popularity over the years. I mean, you even have a Nobel Prize laureate who said, raising the price of carbon is a necessary step for solving climate change. The rest is fluff, right? However, as hinted in the question, these type of market-based mechanisms may not suffice, right, to solve the crisis. There's no evidence suggesting that. and a regulation, and they need to be complemented at least with regulations, right? That can provide the urgency to innovate. So things like, efficiency, energy efficiency standards, product prohibitions, and so on. And in the EU, I mean, there is evidence of regulations really leading to economies of scale of low carbon technologies. In the EU, for example, the progressive ban of incandescent bulbs, right, to favor LED bulbs led to the scale up of LED bulbs that became basically the price of LED lights reduced as a result of the prohibition, and it basically managed to artificially create market scales, right, for a low carbon technology. However, the one thing I would like to stress is that there are regulations and then there are smart regulations, right? In the context of a country that lacks pre-existing capabilities in a particular sector, it's not just by imposing, a regulation that you'll have naturally, the sector emerging. People might resist it, or it might just be inefficient. People found ways around it. That's why, something that comes to mind is in Ecuador, they have, regulations in place regarding the efficiency standards of exhaustion pipes for cars. But as a result, people just cheat the system, right? They just change it before they need to go for the check or whatever. But another regulation could be to make kind of environmental friendly exhaustion pipes cheaper, right, than the normal ones, or create a whole industry around it, and so on. I hope that answers the question, but maybe if someone else wants to add something. Manuel has wrote a lot about the return of industrial policy in Latin America after its dismissal in the 80s.
Yeah, I think Jose Luis, were you wanting to comment also?
Yes, let me put an example. We're in the pandemic. We're in a slump. We want to recover. The technology is there to retrofit vehicles from internal combustion into electric. They're 50% cheaper than new. You don't need an automobile industry to do this. But the transport sector is hesitant because of safety concerns or because they don't have a clear model. If I were the Minister of Finance, I would be urging that sectoral ministry to regulate so that enhances investment and activity so I can tax more and at the same time diversify the economy and get out of the slump faster. That's how unappreciated, understated the regulatory barrier is.
Well, and I think we're going to have to move on to the next question. I have things I want to say about that also, but I won't do that. This next question, I think, is pretty clearly for Lisa from Javier Jaraba. In countries like Colombia that are facing a lack of natural gas for residential and industrial use and electricity generation, what's their best option? To go for unconventional oil and gas production, which is needed and for which they might have the resources, or importing more expensive gas to satisfy its domestic needs?
Thank you. Well, I think it's a complex question to answer because there are a lot of different factors that Colombia has to consider. My first response is that I think it's much more important for climate change mitigation to focus on reducing consumption and providing alternatives to fossil fuels than on reducing production when you'll end up importing from another country. So I think Colombia is doing a lot to, make more renewable energy available. But I think, as long as they're relying on gas from a climate change standpoint, there's no reason for them not to produce it themselves. In addition to that, in terms of unconventional specifically, I think the U.S. experience, the U.S. has a lot of experience. And I think what we know now is that with proper regulations that are actually implemented, unconventional development doesn't pose any more environmental risks or health risks than conventional development. So I think the question right now in the debate in Colombia is, can the local governments really implement the regulations? I think that they can. So I think it makes sense to focus on that. Although I'm not sure that the unconventionals I think most of the natural gas potential is really more offshore. So I don't know that unconventional drilling would really solve all of the needs for natural gas for the country. So I think it would make more sense to produce it themselves than to rely on imports of LNG. And by the way, LNG is also more emissions intensive than just producing the gas and putting it through pipelines. So that's a problem as well. I think though they also have to consider the risk of stranded assets. So, you would have to look at if you're investing now in producing gas in the country and the facilities to use the gas, what's your projection for how many decades you would use that? I think that natural gas will be used I believe, for decades to come. So I don't necessarily think that's a risk, but I think you would have to analyze that as a possibility too. So, I mean, I don't want to give, I don't think that I could give like a very specific answer because I think there are too many different factors that the country would have to consider, but that's how I would look at it.
Okay, thank you. And now this one, conversely, I'm not 100% sure of where it should go, but I think I'm going to give Manuel the first no because I think you might be able to answer this one, Manuel. So we have a question from Adriana Dergam, who's the at the European Technology Chamber. And she says, I would like to hear from the speakers their thoughts on digitalization and green economy in Latin America, and especially the barriers they see. So is that one you can do, Manuel, or shall I ask the larger group?
I can do a little bit and then leave the experts the rest. No, as I said, I mean, at the end of my presentation, I basically talked about the importance of Industry 4.0. I mean, the fourth industrial revolution and how this could actually speed up the circular economy transition. I mean, there are examples like, smart waste management systems, for instance, where we actually see now the inclusion of technological advances to speed up the circular economy transition. Everything that speaks to eco-design, additive manufacturing, everything that helps visualize things well before you actually get to produce things. Of course, data analytics, big data platforms, and so on and so forth. That really speaks to a changing business model towards servitization. So for us, the technological advances is a key ingredient for the circular economy to be profitable. Now, the problem with that is that it doesn't really deal with one of the major issues that we've got in Latin America, is that the circular economy is highly related to the informal economy, and how you deal with bringing in all these technology advances where most of these trash pickers and stuff and recyclers are actually in the informal economy. So there's this big debate, but certainly we get to see more and more pilots of how the fourth industrial revolution technologies are actually being applied for the green recovery, and it certainly works pretty well.
Well, I think that was a very satisfactory answer, in fact. So we have 4 questions left in 2 minutes, but I'm going to ask if maybe people can stay 5 extra minutes and we can try to answer these last 4 questions, if that's all right. Okay. So a question now from Bruno Perez Almanzi, who's a PhD fellow at CONICET Argentina. He would like to ask if you think there's any space for green industrialization on a bigger scale. And I guess several of you could probably answer this. For example, the production of lithium batteries. Is the political will enough to reach these goals, or will external limits make it impossible? I don't know if that's, Amir, is that one that you would like to take on, or José Luis? Can we do large scale production of lithium batteries?
We have several barriers. Right now, we'll talk just about the example of public transportation, which illustrates the point very well. It's impossible to know, almost impossible to know, when the next city will buy the next electric bus. For that kind of demand, only the Chinese are ready to supply the world and tend to this unstructured urban demand in Latin America. If the cities were able to coordinate and program their demand for the decade, then the industry would be in a position to respond to that demand at an appropriate scale. As long as we have an atomized demand from the cities, then we are creating an impossibility for the industry to respond. So we need to coordinate demand and supply, and then we would have a much more enabling condition to allow for a Latin American industrial response.
There's actually another closely related question here from Cecilia Seri from Roma Tre University in Rome that I'll also just pose, because it's also on electric mobility and the lithium triangle and things like that. She asked the additional question of what kind of policies do you think are needed in order to maximize the beneficial impacts in terms of upgrading, but then also reduce the environmental impacts of extraction and related social concerns. I don't know if there's somebody who can speak to that aspect of it.
Maybe I can, Jose Luis provided a really interesting and thoughtful answer. Maybe I can add something to that, which is, in terms of the scale of green industrialization, there are many factors at play, and one of which is also, as Jose Luis mentioned, the size, the international demand, but also possibly the size of the domestic market. In that sense, for example, Brazil could do things in terms of coordinating supply and demand that countries like Ecuador, or smaller economies simply can't, right? Because they don't have the domestic market scales to reach economies of scale for some technologies. The other thing is, in terms of the scale, then you go back into the idea of the carbon footprint of green industrialization or some activities or lithium extraction. There is a big push in Latin America and Chile in particular for biomining, right? Finding ways to extract commodities, because the idea is that, well, if you're going to use copper or lithium in electric battery, then, if you emit so much greenhouse gas, when you extract, there's no point, right? And something to also take into account is the life cycle of emissions, right? So you emit CO2, let's say, or carbon or methane when you extract the commodity, but how much are you saving, right, from emissions from the use of, let's say, a lithium battery or from copper and so on? And the question in terms of the policy will sufficient or lithium-based industrialization, the policy will is not sufficient at all, right? You can see that in many different commodities. When countries try, Hirschman had the argument of one thing leads to another, right, in terms of adding value to commodities, but it doesn't happen through market forces alone. And you even see it with lithium, right? The production of electric batteries is concentrated in a few countries that don't necessarily produce lithium. It requires a lot of human capital. It requires a lot of investment in R&D. It requires incentives to bring investors, right, and produce of electric batteries closer to where the lithium is extracted. And we go back to then the role of industrial policies that will be really necessary to make the most of, let's say, lithium abundance as an industrial development opportunity.
Thank you, Amir. That was really a nice compliment to Jose Luis's answer. This next question, I skipped over this before, but I'll come back now to Juliette Gautron, a current Cambridge student from France. This is really, I think, mostly directed at Manuel, since it's about the circular economy in particular. While green growth and green recovery focuses well on the technology transition to decouple GDP growth from carbon emissions, do you think it can really tackle the issues of waste production linked to overconsumption? Are a circular economy and green growth really compatible, as green growth still supports a growth-led type of development? So, raising one of those fundamental questions about the circular economy. I imagine you've heard this one before.
I have. In fact, there's no magic answer to that. I think there is. We need to understand that the circular economy is not a panacea to solve these problems. And I think, although we keep saying that waste valorization is the end of pipe of the circular economy, we still believe that it has to be done because of the amount of waste we're sitting in, and therefore we foresee that waste management systems will be developed and implemented over time with improvements with technology, because of the results of this wasteful way of life that we've experienced over the last 70 years. And that's not going away. That has to be there. So we see the circular economy in two main ways to support the green transition. One is trying to clean up the mess that is being caused in the past. And I think, all the elements coming with recycling and waste to energy and so on and so forth are coming very strongly in the region. In fact, I mean, we as UNIDO, one of our big areas of work is waste to energy. And the other one comes from a total redefinition of industrial processes, starting from design, is supporting companies to start thinking about industrial processes differently, starting from designing out ways to develop businesses that design out waste from the start. So there's two different branches that we actually see on the circular economy coming. And if you agree with this, then you're opening up to whole spectrums of skills, coming from the trash pickers to those industrial experts that are incorporating industrial or eco design, or architects that are using building information modeling, to those that are very, very end of pipe activities where the skills are very low. So the problem that we are facing now with circular economy is that it speaks to such broad aspects of the economy that is really hard to pinpoint specific elements as to whether the circular economy will have an impact on decoupling. We certainly believe that is one of the main ingredients for this transition, but it's hard to predict that it can solve by itself of the problems. I mean, I've seen also in the chat that there's quite a bit of talk about greenwashing, and we actually see it throughout the region. I mean, this is so common. Companies setting up their own sustainability departments to tell the world that they do a good job, but they're going back to business as usual. So I think we need to do more work on the circular economy, understand a bit more the fundamentals behind it, and certainly we have to demystify the concept because now it's on top of the world, and we need to really throw light on what really does and what it really does not.
Well, thank you for that answer, very thoughtful answer. We have one question left. It comes from Rodrigo Moreira of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, in Chile. And he directs it to Manuel Albaladejo. I think probably all of you could probably give us some insight into this question. There are yet no definitions of what types of requirements or restrictions will be imposed by the EU or other developed countries to Latin America's exports, particularly in the case of raw materials or agricultural products. And of course, I'm hearing echoes of those border carbon adjustments and things like that are very much being talked about these days. In your opinion, what are the main challenges that this type of exports will experience?
Right. I mean, Rodrigo perhaps knows what we're facing here in Uruguay. I mean, I'm also representing UNIDO in Chile, and one of the issues that we're trying to address here in Uruguay is something that is being done in Chile, which is the concept of labeling, eco-labeling, but not only by looking at the nutritional content of food products, but also how the product uses resources and so on and so forth. So one of the issues that we actually see is the private sector not being keen to actually move into eco-labeling. So many companies actually think that this is a barrier to enter European markets, but we believe that this is one of the trends that is coming. So that is one of the challenges that we have, is how do we match the sort of requirements that will be coming in the near future with this preparation phase that we've got ahead of us to make sure that the companies actually comply with those. And as I said, this is not something just coming from the European Union. This is also something that we see with the new ISO standards that are being designed nowadays. I mean, there will be certainly circularity standards flying around, which are being built on the existing ISO standards. And those are the things that we see coming. So I think the challenge remains, how do we bring in the private sector to understand that these market requirements will be coming and will be imposing barriers to companies in not only Latin America, but around the world.
Well, it's really
I could add
been,
a quick
go ahead,
comment
yes.
on the car. Well, just from the kind of political view from Washington, I mean, I'm seeing that there are some Latin American countries that are concerned about how the Biden administration might apply a carbon adjustment tax. I think it's an idea that it's something that's very complex to implement, and we don't know, what it would look like. But I think some of the countries, especially the ones that are getting some attention for not doing enough to address climate change, like Brazil, we're seeing that there's some concern here that the US might try to use these types of mechanisms and trade mechanisms in general to pressure some of the countries to, do more in certain areas on climate change. And I'm not sure that they all want to do that. So there's some concern here about that.
Yeah, Jose Luis, one last word.
Yes, a little bit of a different approach. The European Union, the importers of the exports of Latin America could do much better in terms of recognizing a few things. For example, Latin America has a much lower carbon footprint of its energy matrix than many other areas in the world. If there were, for example, a carbon labeling in international trade, that would benefit actually Latin America and the Caribbean. And deforestation is mainly driven by Brazil as a whole in Latin America. So, for example, Cuba, Uruguay, Chile are gaining forest coverage. So they could be exporting labeled, traceable products that have a lower environmental footprint, but the international market is just not recognizing that. In fact, Chile tried to export green, accident-free, low-water footprint copper, and there's not a market for that. The buyers could be doing much more than what they're doing now.
Yeah, I think that market side of things has often been underestimated as part of the green economy movement. Well, it has really been a great pleasure to listen to all of you today. It's been such a fascinating discussion, and I think you can tell from all of the questions that our audience has really been interested in that. So thank you very much, Manuel Albaladejo, Lisa Viscidi, José Luis Samaniego, and Amir Lebdioui. We thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you very much, everyone, including the audience, for taking part. And we're very grateful to all of you for taking time today to be with us. So without further ado, thank you, and we'll hope to see you again.